When you think of poor military performances by the French, you almost always think of their collapse in World War II. That is understandable. Their determination to fight off the Nazi war machine was, to put it mildly, underwhelming. However, there is actually another candidate for the title of worst military performance by the French. That is the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. When that war started, everyone would have assumed that France would win. It had a larger population, a larger army, and a much more powerful navy. The nation of France had existed for a long time, so it had a strong sense of national unity. Prussia, on the other hand, had only recently acquired much of its territory, so it wasn't certain that those populations would be loyal. In the end, all those advantages counted for nothing. Not only did France lose, it lost incredibly fast and in an almost farcical manner. In only 6 weeks, it was effectively defeated, and the French emperor was a prisoner of war. So, why was France so ineffective? Why couldn't its powerful army and navy defeat the smaller nation of Prussia? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But first, let's have an overview of how it happened, the story of the Franco-Prussian War. Before that, I'd like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN. NordVPN is an incredibly fast VPN that with just one click can protect you from scams, phishing, and malware designed to steal your information. Public Wi-Fi, like what you find in cafes or malls, is often not secure. If you use unencrypted websites, hackers can intercept your data, steal your passwords, and even access your credit card details. NordVPN encrypts your data on your computer, meaning that there's no risk of it getting intercepted. Another feature of NordVPN is that it allows you to route your internet traffic through other countries. That means that you can be in one location, but the websites that you're using will think that you're in another. Lots of companies change their pricing or their services depending on where they think a user is. By changing your location, you can get a better price on some services or access content that would otherwise be unavailable in your area. NordVPN offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it completely risk-free. Right now, you can use the link in the description, nordvpn.com/Henry, to get a discount. That's nordvpn.com/Henry. In the mid-1800s, the major power on mainland Europe was France. It had a thriving economy, a formidable navy, and a massive army. It was also a major colonial power with territories all over the globe. In the previous years, it had expanded its empire in all sorts of places, including the Mediterranean, Africa, China, and Mexico. France also had a reasonable amount of influence in Germany, with good relationships with many of the small states in the West. However, France's hegemony in Europe was about to be challenged by a rising power to the east, Prussia. Prussia was once a small state in the north of modern-day Poland, but had grown to become one of the largest German states. Its rise had been driven by a relentless focus on military power, a strong centralized state, and a determination to unite all ethnic Germans under its rule. Berlin, Prussia's capital, had become one of the most dynamic cities in the world, a hub of technological innovation. At the helm of that transformation was Otto von Bismarck, one of the most talented politicians in history. Under his leadership, Prussia embarked on a series of wars to expand its territory. In 1864, it defeated Denmark and annexed some important provinces. Then, in 1866, it launched a war against Austria and achieved a surprising victory against the much larger empire. That triumph was a turning point in the struggle for influence over the many small German states. For centuries, it was Austria that had claimed to be the leader of the Germanic people, but the war with Prussia changed that. Prussia had managed to create a coalition of North German states which went on to defeat Austria. That allowed it to establish the North German Confederation in 1867, effectively unifying the north of Germany under its leadership. However, for Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian Chancellor, that wasn't enough. What he really wanted was to unify all of Germany, not just the north. The problem was that not all of the German states wanted to unify with Prussia. Some of them, such as Bavaria and Baden, actually liked being small independent states and had resisted unification. Bismarck's solution was war. Not a war with the German states themselves, but instead a war with France. Now, it needed to be a war in which France looked like the aggressor. The idea was that if he could provoke France to start a war with Prussia, those southern Germanic states would view France as an aggressive, menacing presence on their border. They would then be cowed into unifying with Prussia, wanting the protection of being part of a larger nation. Of course, to start a war with France in which France looked like the aggressor wasn't necessarily going to be straightforward. Luckily for Bismarck, the perfect opportunity was about to present itself. It would emerge out of a seemingly irrelevant crisis in a seemingly irrelevant country, Spain. In 1867, Spain was engulfed in a revolution and the Queen was forced to abdicate. The leading candidate to replace her was a German nobleman, and crucially, he was part of the same dynasty as the Prussian royal family. For France, that was incredibly alarming. If the Prussian prince was on the throne of Spain, then Spain might become essentially a client state of the increasingly powerful Prussia. That would leave France surrounded. The French emperor requested that the Prussian king prevent the prince from taking the throne of Spain. The king pretty much agreed. He accepted the French demands, but stopped short of promising that he would do the same if a similar situation happened again in the future. It seemed like the incident had come to an end and that France had achieved an easy diplomatic victory. However, Prussia's cunning Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had other ideas. He was going to use the incident to start the war that he wanted. Bismarck released a heavily edited version of the exchange between the French emperor and the Prussian king. He totally distorted the Prussian king's words to make them appear dismissive and insulting towards France. That enraged the French public and leadership, as they thought the Prussians had contempt for them. Feeling humiliated, the French fell into Bismarck's trap and declared war on Prussia on July the 19th, 1870. Bismarck's plan had worked perfectly. He had got his war with France, and crucially, it looked like they had started it. Because of that, the southern German states, which had been afraid of Prussia's power, quickly allied with it. The war began with a rapid Prussian invasion of France. French forces were poorly prepared and disorganized. Prussia's decisive action overwhelmed them and they were unable to fight off the advance. Within just a few weeks, the Prussians had won several battles and the French were forced to retreat. In mid-August, they besieged the key fortress of Metz in northeastern France. French forces stationed there tried multiple times to break out, but they were ultimately surrounded and began to run out of supplies. In early September came the decisive Battle of Sedan. Overwhelmed by the larger Prussian force, the French army was encircled and Emperor Napoleon III himself was captured. Of the 124,000 French troops at Sedan, about 17,000 were killed or wounded, and around 100,000 were taken prisoner. Following that crushing defeat, the French government collapsed and was replaced by a provisional government. That did little to turn the tide of the war, and the new government struggled to rally the French military. At Metz, the siege dragged on for weeks. Eventually, in late October, the fortress surrendered and more than 170,000 French troops were taken prisoner. In those two major catastrophes, Sedan and Metz, France had lost nearly 250,000 troops. The Prussians then set their sights on Paris. They surrounded the capital, and over the next few months they bombarded it relentlessly. Attempts to break the siege repeatedly failed, and the population became increasingly desperate. Supplies dwindled, leading to a severe food shortage. Unrest within the city grew, and some people demanded a surrender to end the suffering. In other parts of France, the war wasn't going any better. Disorganized and demoralized, the remnants of the French army failed to mount an effective counterattack. There were various minor battles, but nothing came of them, and the Prussians were able to hold on to their gains. At the same time, diplomatic efforts to negotiate a peace didn't make much progress, as the Prussians insisted on harsh terms. Eventually, after nearly 5 months under siege, Paris surrendered. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Frankfurt, which imposed harsh terms on France. It was required to cede the rich provinces of Alsace and Lorraine and pay 5 billion francs in reparations. Overall, the war had been a disaster for France. Its military had failed spectacularly, losing every major battle. It had suffered immense casualties, with more than 130,000 dead in comparison with Prussia's 50,000. Its formidable navy had achieved absolutely nothing. It was the worst military defeat that France had ever suffered.
So, that is what happened. The rapid and decisive defeat of France by Prussia. That is absolutely not what the French leadership was expecting. In fact, in 1869, just a year before the war, the French War Minister said to Emperor Napoleon, "We are stronger than the Prussians on a peace footing and on a war footing." They weren't actually alone in thinking that. All around the world, the French were believed to have one of the best militaries. So why did they perform so badly? What went wrong with the French military to make it so ineffective?
Well, a big clue is in the fact that the war was basically decided within about 6 weeks. Technically, it went on for half a year, but in reality, the French were defeated right at the beginning. So what happened in those early few weeks that cost France the war? More than anything, it came down to speed. As soon as the war started, the Prussians moved incredibly fast to get their forces into position and invade France. The units were well organized and rapidly advanced across the border. The French were blindsided by the speed of the Prussian mobilization and were totally unable to keep up. They did try to get their forces into position to repel the invasion, but they were nowhere near fast enough. The effect of that is that in almost all of the early battles, they were heavily outnumbered. At the first battle, the Battle of Wissembourg on August the 4th, they were outnumbered 4-1. At the Battle of Worth, 2 days later, they were outnumbered 3-1. At the Battle of Sedan, the most important battle of the war, they were outnumbered almost 2-1. Those ratios actually underestimate how much of an advantage the Prussians had early on. Aside from their greater numbers, they had a better command structure with orders relayed swiftly and reliably. They also had better equipment and were better trained. Had the war progressed at a slower pace, the French might have had time to get their forces into gear, but as it happened, the Prussians didn't give them a chance. That, of course, begs the question of why the French were so slow off the mark. I think one of the most important reasons is that the French mobilization system had some major flaws. The biggest problem was that the French regiments weren't stationed in the same place as their equipment. The equipment of the French troops was held in depots which were all over the country. During mobilization, soldiers first had to travel to their depots to collect their equipment and then travel to where their regiment was. Sometimes that would mean traveling from one end of France to the other. In the most absurd cases, men who lived right next to the German frontier had to travel to depots in the south of France to collect their equipment, only to return to the north. Astonishingly, a majority of the French troops lived far from their depots. One estimate put it at 64 out of 100 infantry regiments. As you would imagine, that inefficient process made mobilization much slower than it should have been. Some units took a whole month to reach full strength. Given the urgency of the situation, some units were rushed to the front before they were ready, and of course, that meant that they were far less effective when they finally encountered the enemy. You might be asking why the French used such a crazy system. The main reason was that they were trying to promote unity by avoiding regional differences in the military. Essentially, men from one part of France would be stationed in another part of the country to try to promote one national identity. That system might have been less of a problem if the railway network was better. The French railway network was quite extensive, but it wasn't built for war. It lacked the capacity to handle rapid troop movements, and there were only 4 railway lines that led to the border with Prussia. The Prussian railway system was actually worse than the French one, but the Prussian army was organized into territorial units, which meant that they didn't need to travel so far. That crazy system of mobilization was far from the only issue facing the French military. Another major problem was that France had a very flawed system of conscription. It worked something like this. Men were chosen from all around the country through a ballot. Of course, many of the men that were selected didn't want to serve. Luckily for them, there was actually a way out. If they had the money, they could pay for someone else to take their place. Perhaps as many as a half of the conscripts did that. However, that of course meant that it was disproportionately people with money who were avoiding military service, and so the army came to be dominated by lower class men. The problem with that was that many of those men were illiterate, as many as 20 to 30%. That caused major problems, as training those men to meet the standards of a modern army was much more difficult. In contrast, virtually none of the Prussian soldiers were illiterate. To make matters worse, the system was riddled with corruption. In many cases, if a young man was picked for conscription, his parents would just go to the government office and pay the officer to make the problem go away. Now, in theory, the officer would find another man who would serve in his place. In reality, the money would often be stolen by the officers, and no man would ever go and serve. That meant that there was a large number of quote-unquote ghost soldiers, troops that existed on paper but not in reality. That made it much harder for their leadership to know the true strength of the military. On the eve of war, the French leadership thought that the army had the capacity to deploy over 400,000 troops within 2 weeks. In theory, that would be more than enough to defeat Prussia, which was believed to be able to mobilize about 250,000. In reality, that was a million miles away from the truth. The French army was only able to rapidly deploy about 2/3 of what it thought it could. Many of those men were illiterate and not particularly willing to serve. Emperor Napoleon and his military advisors did understand that there were problems with the system and had attempted to pass reforms. However, that was easier said than done. Many French liberals were reluctant to spend more money on the military, while conservatives opposed the higher taxes that were needed. All that was done was the creation of an additional reserve force called the Garde Mobile. That was meant to be 400,000 men, but in reality it never got up to 100,000. Most of those men were totally unprepared for battle.
As you can see, the French military had some major structural flaws, and I think that was probably their biggest problem. However, as is so often the case, those flaws were exacerbated by poor leadership and grave mistakes on the battlefield.
A good example is the Battle of Mars-la-Tour, fought on August the 16th. In that battle, the French actually had a numerical advantage and should have been able to defeat the Prussians. However, the French general hesitated. He worried his own forces might be encircled and chose to dig in and defend. That hesitation gave the Prussians a chance to act decisively. They launched a bold attack on the French center and were able to disorganize the French lines. Meanwhile, Prussian reinforcements were arriving fast. Over the course of 2 days, the Prussians managed to consolidate their forces while the French were in disarray. When the two sides met again, the now reinforced Prussian army outnumbered the French, who were forced to withdraw. What could have been a French win was in the end a defeat, all because of poor decision-making by the commander. Another good example of poor leadership was during the Battle of Culmiers on November the 9th. The Battle of Culmiers was actually a French victory, the single major victory they had during the whole war. The numbers were vastly on the French side, about 70,000 French troops against just 20,000. The French won, and as a result, recaptured the important city of Orléans, just 120 kilometers from Paris. At the time, the French capital was under siege, and the victory sparked excitement, giving the desperate population of Paris the hope that they would be saved. Those hopes were soon dashed. Instead of pursuing the retreating Germans, who were scattered and vulnerable, the French general decided to stop his advance. That cautious decision wasted what one historian has called the fairest and most promising opportunity during the whole war for reversing the ill fortune of France. Even Prussian commanders later admitted that had the French continued their attack, their entire force, from their general to the last camp follower, would likely have been captured. By pausing instead of pressing their advantage, the French gave the German force time to regroup and escape. That allowed the Prussian High Command to prevent the French from building on their success. Within weeks, the momentum they'd gained was lost. Prussia recaptured Orléans, and the opportunity to relieve Paris was gone. I think those are the main reasons that France lost the war, but there are a few other things worth mentioning. Before that, I just want to say that if you enjoy the videos that we make here, we would be thrilled if you would support us on Patreon. There, supporters get access to various perks, such as personalized video messages from me or even replica World War II medals. Any support would help us produce videos faster and make them higher quality. We would be hugely grateful. The French artillery was much inferior to that of the Prussians. The main problem was simply that it was outdated. The French artillery was made of bronze, while the Prussians was steel. That was a problem because bronze can't handle the same internal pressures or maintain its rifling as well as steel. Steel is harder and has a superior tolerance for heat and pressure, which allowed for more powerful explosions. That meant that the Prussian shells could be fired faster and therefore much further. The range of the French cannons was about 3 kilometers, while the Prussian guns could hit targets 5 kilometers away. Another major difference was that the Prussian artillery was reloaded at the rear of the gun, while the French was reloaded at the barrel. That allowed the Prussians to have a much greater rate of fire. One final problem with the French artillery was that it used time-fused shells. Those are shells which detonate after a specific amount of time rather than on impact. Those often detonated prematurely while they were still in the air. In contrast, the Prussians used shells which exploded upon impact, which were much more effective. The French did try to adopt that type of shell, but by the time they had developed them, it was too late and they couldn't produce them fast enough. Aside from being less advanced than the Prussians, the French artillery was also less well coordinated with the rest of the military. The Prussian artillery was well integrated with their infantry and cavalry, which allowed them to use very effective combined arms tactics. Something else that I think is worth pointing out is the fact that France didn't have any allies. That absolutely didn't have to be the case. There were many other nations that were uneasy about the rise of Prussia and might have been willing to fight with France. In the years before the war, Prussia had been behaving quite aggressively, unifying the north of Germany by force. It had just defeated and humiliated Austria and Denmark, who might have been interested in revenge. If France had been better at diplomacy, it might have been able to win over another power to its side. Perhaps if it had offered Austria or Denmark some of the territories that they had lost in exchange for getting involved, then they might have been willing. Even if France hadn't managed to win over other states to its side, it might have been able to prevent some of Prussia's allies from joining it. I've not mentioned it much in the video, but Prussia actually had over 20 states fighting alongside it, including Saxony and Bavaria. If France had been better at diplomacy, it might have been able to persuade those states to stay neutral. The reason that that didn't happen is because Prussia, and in particular Otto von Bismarck, so totally outwitted the French Emperor Napoleon III. It was because the Prussians managed to make the French look like the aggressors that all those German states decided to side with Prussia. That was also a big part of the reason why France failed to get any allies. If France had had some allies, it might have totally changed the course of the war. For example, it actually asked Denmark to get involved in an amphibious landing in the Baltics, but Denmark refused. If that front had opened up, it might have been hugely valuable, as Prussia would have had to divert resources away from the invasion of France. If it had gone well, Prussia might have found itself on the defensive all of a sudden. Britain was another power that might have been won over. It too was wary of the rise of Prussia, and maybe it could have been persuaded to get involved. In the end, it remained neutral, and if anything, it actually sided with Prussia by undermining France's naval blockade. Overall, France's diplomatic isolation was an important factor in its defeat. One final thing to mention is that France had a lot of problems with division and disunity. A good example of that is that they didn't have much loyalty to their emperor. We can see that best when we look at what happened when Emperor Napoleon III was captured at the Battle of Sedan. Instead of fighting hard to secure his release, the French basically said, "Oh well," and declared a republic. They hoped that the new republic would make everyone more determined to resist the invasion, and to some extent it did. The new government decided to fully mobilize France against Prussia. It passed a new conscription law, which they hoped would raise about 700,000 fresh troops. As you can see, the new republic really was willing to sacrifice a lot for the war effort. However, there were still big problems with division and disunity. There was a big debate over whether to defend Paris or fight a guerrilla war in the countryside. Some people thought that the French army could harass the Prussians and disrupt their supply lines. It would have made the war an all-out national struggle and probably would have caused huge destruction, but it might have worked. In the end, the idea was abandoned in favor of trying to save Paris at all costs. That didn't work, and Paris was never relieved. Perhaps a rural guerrilla war might have been a more effective strategy. Overall, there are many reasons that France performed so badly in the Franco-Prussian War, from the big structural problems to poor leadership. Some credit does have to go to the Prussians, as they performed extremely well. In reality, it was a very bad idea for France to get involved in the war in the first place. The reason that it did was simply hubris. In the years before the war, France actually had several military victories. In the 1850s, it was on the winning side of the Crimean War against Russia and the Second War of Italian Independence against Austria. At the same time, France was expanding its colonial empire, gaining territories in Africa, Vietnam, Cambodia, and the Middle East. Those successes led to hubris on the part of Napoleon III and made him far more confident than he should have been when the prospect of war with Prussia was on the horizon. That hubris would end his reign and bring about the creation of a huge new power on the continent, Germany. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring today's video. Use the link nordvpn.com/Henry to get a discount